Welcome everyone. Lovely to see you all. And I'm delighted to be introducing Marlies today. So, as many of you know, my name is Armina Ishkanyan, and I'm a professor in the Department of Social Policy at LSE, and also the Executive Director of the Atlantic Fellows for Social and Economic Equity at the program. Today's speaker is Professor Marlies Glasius. Marlies is a professor of international relations in the Department of Politics at the University of Amsterdam, and she is currently a fellow of the Wissenschaft College in Berlin. Probably mispronounced that, sorry. And she's returned to Berlin today, so very quick trip. But thank you for coming, Marlies. So Marlies's main research interests are in the rise of the super rich, authoritarianism, global civil society, and international criminal justice. So Marlies will speak for about 45 minutes, and then there'll be an opportunity to ask her any questions following the presentation. I'll take questions both in person and online, and I ask everyone, please hold your questions until the end. So without further ado, over to you, Marlies.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I really love being here. My assumption has been that you come from very different backgrounds and studying inequalities from very different approaches. So I'm going to start by introducing to you a little bit the issue of the concentration of wealth in recent decades, before I explain to you the data set we've put together and some of the analysis that is coming out of it. So we're talking about concentration of wealth, not income. And here, the World Inequality Report gives us a sense of how that has been happening. The bottom half of the world population owned about 1.5% of total global wealth in 1995. By 2020, they've graduated to about 2%, because the vast majority of that bottom half doesn't have any wealth, any assets to speak of at all. More remarkable is what's happening here. The top 0.001% of the global population, these are people who have assets of approximately $50 million or more, has gone from about 3.4% global wealth, a big peak in the toughest than the global financial crisis, but it's gone further up to 6.5%, and by now I'm pretty sure we're at 7% of global wealth owned by the richest 0.001% of the population. Should I turn on the mic? Or is it on? You think it's okay? Okay. Now we're going to zoom in further from that 0.001% to billionaires. In 1987, there were 140 billionaires in the world, and together they have assets of $300 billion. Only now, there are about 3,000 billionaires, and together they own $14 trillion. That's 14 and 12 zeros. The richest 100 of those, the 0.00001% of the global population, own more than a third of that, about $5.5 trillion, which is 1% of global wealth is in the hands of 100 people. Now, if the billions and trillions sound very abstract to you, let me do a little thought experiment to try and get you a sense of what that really means. Imagine I pay you $1,000 an hour, not for a working week, but 24 hours a day, 365 days of the year. And I've been doing so since the pyramids of Giza were built 2,600 years ago. You would then come in at about $40 billion. You'd be about halfway on my index, actually the Forbes index of the 100 richest people in the world. Elon Musk still has about 12 times as much as wealth as you do, And the richest person in Europe, Bernard Arnault, owns 5 times as much. And that's beginning to give you a sense, perhaps, of the staggering wealth that we're talking about here. And I've given you a sense of its recent increase as well. So my structure of my talk will be, I've spoken about the wealth concentration. Now I'll get to taxation, why it matters. Then I'll introduce the data set of the sayings and doings of the richest 100 billionaires living in democracies for almost 30 years. And then I'll go to 2 aspects of what we found in that data set. What billionaires say about especially personal taxation, and what billionaires do, what we could find out about what billionaires actually do in terms of tax avoidance and evasion. Let's first go to the tax base of billionaires. This, taking again somebody else's research, the Global Tax Evasion Report, which shows us here, as we know, that the French pay a lot more tax than the United States. Here we see wealth brackets. The Netherlands is a little bit in between, but here, from the 1%, we see most of them go down. And then when we get to this bracket of billionaires, they will nosedive. There's some methodological issues with this. There are actually 3 slightly different pieces of research spliced together. But I don't think anyone disagrees with this finding that billionaires pay less tax as a percentage of their wealth than everybody else. And that's because most of their income comes from capital and not from salaries. And capital is taxed less than salaries almost everywhere in the world. Why does that matter? Well, first of all, because we need the money to pay for public services. Second, there's a fairness argument where you could have philosophical discussions about whether and how much the rich should pay more than the not so rich. But I don't think there's any philosophical argument that they should pay less. And yes, yet in percentage terms, that's what happens. And it's not just a matter of fairness. Of course, other people seeing this, it also affects their tax morale, their inclination to be honest and pay as much as they want to. Finally, and that's kind of a deeper structural issue, we know that there is a virtuous relation between greater material equality in the world and better quality of democracy. We also think, we assume, there's a vicious relationship between greater within-country material inequality and lesser quality of democracy. I'm not going to talk about that today. It's what I want to do in the future, but I did want to put it out there. How did we get to this situation? It wasn't always the case that capital was taxed less than labor and that it was in fact taxed so little. It starts with financial globalization, the opening up of borders to capital, global tax competition, but also a policy consensus that it's actually the right thing to not have entrepreneurs pay too much taxation because they create the wealth, or so the story went. And then there are 2 groups that I would call enablers: lobbyists, who are talking to policymakers about what taxation law should look like. And for a lot of us, that's very abstruse and difficult to do. It's a profession. And then secondly, so-called wealth managers, the people who help the super rich manage their wealth, including giving advice on paying as little tax as possible. I just wanted to plug this book, if you don't know it, by Brooke Harrington, who has immersed herself in a wealth management course and then spoke to about 60 of these people around the world. Great sociological work. But things have begun to move in the last decade. After the crisis, and I'll show that to you, my own findings as well, the debate about how much the super rich should pay, how much, or whether there should be pure wealth taxation was rekindled. But also in terms of international tax policy, important things were finally possible. And after international agreements, tax authorities of about 140 countries started to actually exchange information, not occasionally and on request, but automatically as a matter of course, which really, really helped with blocking some of the simplest forms of evasion. Then there were all these leaks and scandals, the Panama, Paradise, Pandora papers. And we're now in a further stage where behind shell companies, we're trying to find out who the actual owners, instead of kind of formal figurehead owners of shell companies are. I'm not going to talk to you a lot about all the literature there is on these topics, just that I'm kind of wanting to relate to sociological literature on reproduction, intergenerational wealth, social mobility, economics and international political economy, who have really tried to estimate the size and the structure of the offshore economy. Media studies, thinking about discourses of inequality. And in economics and political economy, we also find literature on general attitudes to taxation and compliance. Then to the data set. In my previous work, I did some discourse analysis on how some business-friendly media wrote about super rich tax affairs, super rich tax avoidance. And in the course of doing that, I was looking especially at the Sunday Times here. They have a rich list, and at Forbes in the United States. What I realized is that billionaires are kind of like Taylor Swifts and Beyoncés of the business world. People are fascinated with them. And as a result, there is so much information you can find out about them. So although it's virtually impossible to systematically do surveys or interview billionaires, you can actually gather a lot of information about them. And we gathered information, and we is 3 fantastic student assistants, my colleague Sander van Hapen and I, about the 100 richest billionaires, all families where there's kind of clearly usually one economically most active member. We only looked at democracies because in autocracies, taxation is not really the issue in terms of fishy relations between the regime and the richest people. We looked over the past decade, so it's not just the last 5 seconds or so. People alive or recently dead, and we used the Forbes Global Billionaires for that. And we had 3 categories we're interested in: background information, the year of birth, gender, whether it was inherited wealth or self-made, the nationality, residence, and the sector of the economy. And then 2 more substantive sections. 1, public statements about everything that isn't corporate taxation, so personal taxation, income tax, wealth tax, dividend, capital gains, inheritance, estate and gift tax, property tax, over almost 30 years. And the second was a category of finding information about what we've decided to call tax minimization, both legal avoidance and illegal evasion, because the line is often quite blurry. In terms of the sources we used for the tax speech, we looked a lot, especially at kind of business-friendly media. These people give a lot of interviews. Occasionally, they're also on social media. And it was actually quite easy because you find whenever one of these really rich billionaires says anything, it gets amplified and you find the same information again and again. For the more recent stuff, we Googled mostly. For the earlier period, we also used the Nexus database. For the tax minimization behavior is more often kind of tax exposés, critical literature, tax advocacy, informational lawsuits sometimes, and interestingly also tax advice. So very often when something got exposed about a billionaire, there'd be kind of a law firm explaining exactly what they've done and whether you could do this too was actually quite a useful source. Limitations, despite the enormous amount of work, it's still small numbers, especially if you want to do inferential statistics. Tax speech may be considered cheap talk. We don't pretend that it reveals the real preferences of billionaires, but it's informative in the sense that it gives us information about what a billionaire finds socially acceptable or politically opportune to say about taxation, if anything at all. And it's also consequential because these people are seen as gurus in some of the business world, so it matters what they have to say. The tax minimization behavior turned out, and I think we should have known that in advance perhaps, to be a lot more difficult. There are severe data limitations because, of course, nobody wants their tax avoidance behavior exposed. So it's typically covert, and when we don't find anything, it doesn't mean there's nothing there. It's also difficult to quantify, both in terms of financial consequences, but even to say, you know, what is 1 or 5 forms of tax minimization? If you have 100 million in one tax haven, or you have 5 times 10 million in 5 tax havens, you know, how do you quantify that? So we've been very conservative in our coding. It's also difficult sometimes to pinpoint its timing and duration. And of course, the regulatory environments are different between different countries of the world. I'll get back to that. I thought there would be 1 or 2 articles this, but I'm now thinking 4 papers and a more popular science book. I'm only going to talk today about the first 2, what they say, and in particular, we are asking an over time question there. Have billionaires become more tax-friendly in speech since the financial crisis? So really looking over the duration. And the second, how they do it, which I think of as a taxonomy, you know, different forms of tax minimization techniques, which surprisingly I found hadn't really been done before in that sense. We're thinking about the third paper about variation between billionaires. Not so far with that yet, but we have some early findings if you want to ask about them. And then finally, we found about 28 lawsuits, and I'd really like to dig into those as well. Do they have jurisprudential value? Do billionaires also lose them sometimes? So that's work to come. Let me tell you a little bit about who our billionaires are. They're overwhelmingly male, 92 men and 8 women, and they're also very old. Most of them are still alive, but we did include some people who died recently, but were able to say and do things over the previous 25 years. In terms of nationalities, 42 from the US. I think it would be even more if you looked right now at 2025. A total of 31 from Europe, 9 Indians, and then a little bit of everything. 2/3 are first generation, and only a quarter of them are pure inherited wealth. And we found an important in-between category who already born into riches, usually with their parents' company, but then grow it way more. Sectors, tech and finance and commodities are the biggest ones. Let me just leave it at that. And go straight into our findings on taxation speech. So both my co-author and I coded the speech, the 203 items of speech that we found quite inductively and independently. And we both found 3 main categories. And within that, some of the same arguments, but we also did some reconciling there. So most of the pro-tax arguments are along 2 lines. The one which I imagine a lot of people here probably also subscribe to, is a fairness argument that there is too much inequality and that should be limited and public services need to be paid for. Second important argument we found doesn't talk about how much tax is the right amount of tax for a billionaire to pay, but just says there's a democratic process. And once the legislators have decided that a certain tax needs to be paid, then we ought to be paying it. And there's also a more patriotic than democratic version of that. So here, for instance, if the will of the people is that I should pay more, I will pay more. And then a third, smaller argument that especially focuses on ensuring compliance and how much they hate tax evasion. Now, there were also sometimes billionaires who said, oh, we should focus more on compliance and not raise taxes. Those we have not categorized as pro-tax speech, but rather as kind of ambiguous, indeterminate. There were rather more types of anti-tax speech. The biggest one is to say it's bad for the economy or for entrepreneurship, innovation will be stifled, all that sort of stuff. Here, for instance, companies with a promising future will quickly become takeover candidates by the Chinese. This particular person said, I will stop, which means no more investments, no new jobs, no more donations. So it's macroeconomically bad, or it's ineffective. And then specifically, very often it is, oh, the rich will move, they'll leave. And I'm sure here in London, you're also very familiar with that argument. There are some people who say that it's unfair, it's punitive, it's about punishing the rich for having been successful, or it's wise to avoid paying taxation. And then finally, some say, you know, the money I give to charity, to philanthropy, that's better spent than the government can spend it. But the kind of most unexpected finding was this third category that both me and my co-author ended up with independently, that we've called defensive speech, which is not kind of saying general things for or against this or that taxation, but defends themselves when their own tax behavior has been called into question. Most often type of defense is, it was legal, no wrongdoing here. They also often say they're paying a lot, which of course in absolute terms is always true. They usually pay millions, even if there's so much they're not paying. And again, we're finding that democratic or patriotic commitment. Here's a more patriotic one. The family, these are the masses, prides itself on being responsible Americans who've always paid their taxes in full. And then mitigation by philanthropy. So here's a German who admits, yeah, his dad moved to Switzerland in order to save taxes, but I want to give something back. That's why I support so much. But it's different from the anti-tax because it's more as a mitigation. It's not suggested that money is better spent that way. So those are the three types of speech. I'm not giving you the ambiguous. It's not so interesting. And here is the distribution we found. And we counted in two ways: per Speech Act, 203, and per billionaire, where we gave each billionaire a value of 1, regardless whether they'd spoken 8 times or 2 times. And when we counted per Speech Act, you see that there's not that much difference between pro-tax and anti-tax statements, and the fewest are actually the defensive statements. Whereas when you count per billionaire, the image is quite different. 41 billionaires never say anything at all. That was not a surprise to us because the only study that does something similar on American billionaires found that 3/4 of them didn't speak. So actually, we found them more talkative. But you see that the anti-tax is here twice as much as the pro-tax. And so only the biggest category is this defensive speech. So what do we see here? The pro-tax people are obviously voluble. They talk a lot, even though there's fewer of them. whereas the defensive speech is the most reluctant and silent form of speech. They don't talk all that much at all. So what we really wanted to know is, have billionaires become more tax-friendly since the financial crisis? Well, the colors are kind of obvious and not pretending to be neutral. So green is pro-tax, red is anti-tax, and yellow is defensive speech. And as you see, up until 2008, there's actually very little speech. We don't think that's just about the internet. As I said, we also got a lot of newspaper coverage. And then from 2008, it really goes up from 14 statements to 47, and the pros have it. But then as we move on into further eras, this is when we begin to have automatic exchange of information, that we're also beginning to see these scandals, like the Panama Papers. Suddenly a lot more defensive, but also preponderance is anti, and it stays like that in the latest period. So they're speaking way more after the financial crisis, but not more pro-taxation. So there's not been a shift in what billionaires think they can say. We start looking a bit more at the detail. Very early on, we find that Stephen Persson, the H&M billionaire, managed to single-handedly get rid of Swedish wealth tax by talking a lot in the Swedish media about how bad this stuff is and how it's going to move. Then for quite a while, there's not so much. As soon as we have the onset of the crisis, a big anti-tax speech peak, and then goes on a bit until 2019. And that was really our biggest finding, that in 2019, we suddenly have 11 anti-tax statements, and that's when the US primaries are happening. The final election year is 2020, but it was this time early on that Liz Warren and Bernie Sanders still looked like they had a chance, and this was really part of the debate. And it's not just Americans here, it's also German, French, Indian billionaires weighing in on this. On the pro-tax side, we have a peak here, about 2011, 2012, but mostly it turns out to be 3 people responsible for that, 10 out of the 13 statements. And here we can also see very clearly when we have these leaks, you get defensive peaks. This one isn't one particular leak. I think by this time, tax shaming as kind of a journalistic genre has been taken hold. Defensive stuff. It collapses in 2024. I don't fully understand why. We need to really do 2025 to see whether that's a blip or ongoing. So that kind of concludes the first part of what I wanted to talk about today. So billionaires experience a lot more need to speak, but even if that means they feel under pressure, well, it doesn't mean they feel a need to appear more tax-friendly. If anything, it's the opposite. We're still working on working out the 3 profiles, what we call vocal self-actualizers, who want to tell the world how it ought to be better. Speak a lot, not so many of them. The reluctant self-justifiers, the defensive speech, and then quite strategic opponents who seem to speak when threatened. Okay, so let me then go to the very different other half of the data set, the tax minimization behavior. And remember, there were a lot of limitations to this. So the original idea we had, where we really wanted to relate speech and action, turned out not to work, because we can't say, if we haven't found much tax minimization behavior, that therefore this is a cleaner billionaire. It could also be about a different environment, or simply we couldn't find much on them because they're less famous, or they live in a country where there isn't so much of this type of journalism. But we did find something else. Most of the advocacy, most of the academic literature focuses on three forms of tax minimization: money in tax havens, people physically moving to low tax environments, and what happens with inheritances and inheritance or estate tax. We found 6 other forms of tax minimization, which all seem to work across different jurisdictions, so they're not unique to the United States or Switzerland or whatever. We don't believe our numbers on them, variability low, but we think it's important to have distinguished these different types. So I will spend the next 10 minutes or so taking you through 9 common types of tax minimization. What I want to say with that is that in the wild, we often find them used in combination with each other, but we think that this can be broken down into these basic components. So, tax haven use is probably most familiar to you. We have a slightly broader definition than usual of that, where we say if it's assets held outside your residential jurisdiction with the effect of considerably lowering your dividend, property, capital gains, etc. taxation, we call it tax haven use, even if it's for Germany, for instance. And we do definitely see that this automatic exchange of information brings down the use of tax havens. We're not finding as big an effect as some of the quantitative studies who've tried to do this based on the data on pure financial transfers. Could be because our data is not so good. Could also be because billionaires are particularly good at then finding new solutions. So we see, for instance, so many going from the British Virgin Islands to Luxembourg, where it is then used in combination with other forms of tax minimization that may be legal and are less kind of discredited than the British Virgin Islands. Relocation is kind of very simple to explain. 16 movements by 15 billionaires. 3 to the UK. This is post abolition of the non-dom status. 3 to Switzerland, 4 to Monaco. And in the US, 5 people have moved to Florida, and Elon Musk has moved to Texas. I think it's important to say 29 years, 16 movements, it's not so much. Much more complicated are the different ways in which family wealth transfer, and I'm not saying intergeneration wealth transfer because it can also be from husbands to wives, is associated with tax avoidance. So if we don't count the jurisdictions where there is no inheritance tax to begin with, 2/3 of our billionaires live in environments, Commonwealth, former Commonwealth in the US, where they can use a trust. You put your money in a trust, a trustee is in charge of it, you're no longer in charge, and as a result, the money can go to your heirs untaxed. Fantastic, but it doesn't help you that much if you've been super successful. So poor gentleman, for instance, who saw his shares in his own company skyrocket, his heirs, if we were to die today, would still have to pay capital gains tax, even if they're not paying estate tax. So quite a few solutions to that problem, quote unquote, have been found. Solutions other than to say 20% capital gains tax, okay. One is to have some sort of construction where there's a charity component. So you have something that's half foundation, half trust, and half corporate. And all the supermarket people seem to go for such. The Mortons, the Schweitzer, the Lidl, the Albrechts, the Aldi. Another solution is you sell your stuff to the trust in return for an IOU. Then you can pay capital gains tax up front before all that appreciation. That's the wrong stuff. Or you can decide to give away a lot of your money to your heirs in your lifetime And then you do this thing that rather retains annuity trust that has a shorter lifespan. It's good for volatile money. That also Jensen Wang has done. And then there's like a fourth option in some countries. Family firms are being helped. Farmers are being helped. So many ways to make sure that your inheritance is safe. So these are the three that are well known. We also found it's very easy to set up domestic entities, and it often saves you tax. So this is the BMW heiress who created a holding company simply in Germany, and that pays, she has a lower tariff of capital gains or dividend tax than if she were a private person. It can also be much more complex. So this is Larry Page of Google, who has a family office that sets up more and more and more limited liability companies, and eventually then buys some Caribbean islands. This may be more about secrecy than about tax avoidance, we're not sure. Our data set has 18 billionaires doing this 24 times. We think that wildly underestimates the use of domestic entities, but it's not newsworthy. So via journalism, you don't get at this systematically. 69 of our 100 billionaires have at one point been CEO of their company, and as such, they would have been owed a salary. They like taking that salary down to $1 because otherwise they would be paying top income tax over the salary, just like many of you will be doing. Instead, they get stock options. They don't exercise the options since they're taxable in most companies, in most jurisdictions. They often have the security paid for. One German billionaire had his mother's care home paid for. That was actually challenged successfully by the tax office. Here's a more complex way of doing it. This is Stephen Schwarzman, CEO of BlackRock. He owns private jets and a helicopter, and he gets BlackRock to lease them from him to fly him around. And then they have to pay him for the flying around. And this, of course, is a way of kind of getting a salary without getting a salary. We'll get back to the private jets and yachts and things you can do with that in a minute. You can also borrow money. The simple form is to simply borrow against your assets, usually your shares. And because you're a billionaire, you're good for it. So you can usually get really advantageous terms. And as long as interest is low, this is attractive. So Elon Musk actually bought Twitter, now X, and I don't borrow money. You can also just buy yourself something nice. Complex forms, and that was actually the majority of what we found, you're borrowing from or loan to your own entity. So this is Jolene de Rafael Heineken, the Heineken heiress, who has 50% of the shares. She's owed dividend in the Netherlands. You would have to pay tax over that. But then she suddenly remembers that her 100% holding company in the Netherlands owes money to a 100% holding company in Luxembourg. So now she has to repay the loan. Had previously been on the books. I think this is really tax evasion. And then from Luxembourg, you can go on to Jersey. There it is, tax-free. Each of these constructions is slightly different. I don't always completely understand them, but the net result is obvious. You use the loan in order to make yourself poorer before the tax man. Loss manipulation, the simple form, and this is really interesting. Warren Buffett recommends this. Warren Buffett, the great pro-tax advocate. He says, sell your shares at a loss, then declare it, then buy them back. More complex ways, you can buy a sports company, and even as the stadium and the players appreciate, you can actually write them off as a loss. You can do the same with real estate, with a business building, and also with your yachts and jets. You can make them into a private charter company. Guess what? It doesn't have many customers, so it's loss making. And you then rent it, if you want to actually be on your yacht, from your own charter company, which is another expense. So even yachts are a way to save on taxes. 8 is anticipation, which is quite simply, you see a new tax regulation coming, you do something quickly beforehand. Sometimes we have very few observations, but the ones we have suggest that they thought Biden was going to bring in this billionaire tax, which in the end failed. And finally, tax credits. This is peanuts. This is not a lot of money. But Jeff Bezos and his first wife, Mackenzie, managed to actually claim for childcare, $4,000. We know this because of a leak. Zuckerberg has a lot of land in Hawaii, 90% tax cut because it's agricultural land and we want to support farmers. Wildlife or forestry land, also a tax cut. We have only 5 observations here, but I suspect it probably there's more of it. It's not a lot of money, but it tells us about the mentality of these people. So then is the entire taxonomy of billionaire tax minimization. I won't go over it again. We could always bring the slide up if you're interested in the details. But as I said, the first 3 forms are really well known, well studied, and the other 6, it's not that we don't know about them. They're being advised actually by these so-called wealth managers, but they're not systematically subject to study. So we found at least 84 of our 100 billionaires engaged in some form of tax minimization. And we found that what seems like really complex, sophisticated, completely not understandable constructions can be broken down into these constituent elements that we can label. And I think that can be really important for tax advocates to better understand, for academics to better study, and recognizing these statistics should also be able to improve tax legislation and kind of put up a front against these lobbyists. I understand this so much better. What is to be done? I do think, and this is a point of departure, not a finding, income from capital should, of course, be taxed at least as much as income from labor. Maybe there should also be an annual wealth tax. There are people who suggest that this is also less liable to attempts to avoid it. I'm not sure of that. You do have an entire wealth management industry ranged against you, and loopholes will always be found. But we can get better at understanding. And then finally, back to the tax speech. While we did not find that after the crisis there was more pro-tax attitudes, we did find so much more speech, and a lot of that so-called defensive speech, when there is no need for billionaires to speak up at all. So I do take some comfort from the notion that billionaires are also social creatures and maybe susceptible to reputation in tandem with tighter monitoring. So I do want to see a glimmer of hope at the horizon. What is to be done by me for the next 5 or 10 years? That's an easier one. I really would like to hear more from you about this. There'll be further articles from this data set on variation between billionaires, on lawsuits. I'm also thinking about an article on this weird subset of super rich tax advocates. But really, my broader research agenda, where I want to take this, is to think beyond taxation about political influence of billionaires, not just corporations, but individual billionaires on our politics and on the quality of democracy. We know they've become a lot wealthier. It doesn't immediately follow that they've also become more influential, but it's something I think we need to find out. We understand reasonably well how it works in the United States. Europe is different. We need to find out how. Let me leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent timekeeping, Marlies. That was really great. I want to now open the floor to questions. And I'll take a couple in the room and then Peter, you'll let me know if there's any. Yes, please. And then Denise.
Yes, thank you. That was very interesting. I want to go back to the part about billionaire speech and also tying into your last point about the influence of billionaires on politics in general. So we saw this big increase in all types of speech about tax. And I'm wondering if maybe billionaires just started speaking more in general. It seems like they used to like mind their own business a bit more and maybe lobby behind the scenes. And the last few years, they're way more out there on the political scene and suddenly have opinions on everything. So is that just on tax that they're speaking more, or is it a general trend in other topics too?
Do you mind saying your name for Marlies and your affiliations?
Yes, I'm Clara. I'm in the Master of International Relations.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the short answer to your question is I don't know. But there is reason to believe that billionaires have simply become more visible in other ways. There's a book by someone called Peter Hegel who calls them neoliberal icons. A way that I think I could check for that is there is literature on what billionaires say about climate change. I don't know how far back it is. I would need to check it, but that would be, I think, a very interesting control to see, are we just seeing a general effect of more billionaire speech, or is it taxation in particular that they're addressing here? I do think that kind of the very sudden movement right from 2008 onwards suggests that there is more going on than just greater billionaire visibility.
Denise, and then do you want to say who you work with?
Yes, I'm Denise I'm a professor of global politics at the European Institute. Please, thank you so much for this talk and for presenting the results. I will also ask a question about the speech part of your project. And this is a methods question / more theoretical question. So you don't really need to answer this technical one, methodological one just now, but just this would be a question. So speech act. So I wasn't quite sure how you defined a speech act. So if you have, let's say, a newspaper article from whichever newspaper article, so when you are coding it, whether there is a speech act, you can find 3 speech acts in a single article or 1. So I would be quite interested in that, and whether that would also provide another level of sort of more granular information to what you presented. And related to that, also, I was wondering if you could also, and I think it would be quite interesting, if you could code for where the speech acts are from by the type of publication you got them in. Let's say general newspaper like a daily, national daily, or a specialist publication, etc. Because this would give you insight into the audience as well. So you could then have again another layer, maybe you already have this, or just if you do, but I would be quite interested in, and this is what was lacking for me, is the audience. Where are these messages directed to and how they change, and whether they changed by the audience individually and also longitudinally.
Next to Lisa. Do you want to?
Yep. Yeah. So on, how long is a speech act? We've decided that 1 article is 1 speech act because we wouldn't know how to cut it up. Mostly that's not been such a problem because mostly the speech is fairly brief. So the billionaire gets interviewed, tell us about your success, tell us about your children, what do you think of the world today? And then there'll be 1 tax question, 1 tax answer. The few where the interview goes into taxation at length, very often we ended up coding them as other because there will be a lot of on the one hand, on the other hand. So those were difficult. but there were not many of them. It's usually quite brief, so it wasn't that problematic. In terms of the where, I think I should do that. Just from knowing the data, I do think that a lot of it is what I would call business-friendly journalism. So that can be the Financial Times, Forbes magazine, Bloomberg TV, that sort of stuff. Except sometimes the defensive speech, there'll be an article on somebody having money in the Cayman Islands. That can also be more general newspapers, but we haven't systematically coded it. We should probably do that.
Thank you. I'm going to take an online question and then I had some. So let's take the online one. Together and then we'll go.
Hi, Tanya Burkhardt from the Centre for Analysis of Social Exclusion at LSE. Thanks very much indeed for a fascinating talk and presentation. I was interested in, I think it was the 41 of your billionaires who didn't say anything at all, or at least you didn't find anything that they'd said publicly, and whether you had any further information about their characteristics as compared to the chatty ones, and what we might infer from that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to look into it further when we write this variation paper. What I can kind of say off the cuff is they're more likely, the chattiest ones are in finance and tech, which I think are sectors where people really feel like their own talent has gotten them there. The self-made billionaires are also much more likely to speak. The heirs speak much less. And also people associated with commodities speak much less. So people in construction and mining, what I would say dirty sectors maybe, they're much less likely to have anything to say. But we do still need to look into it in more detail. We also found, and that's worrying, that younger billionaires are both less likely to speak, and when they speak, more likely to be anti-tax than all the billionaires.
Got one more.
Yeah.
No?
Sorry, were you?
Kristen?
Yeah, yes, can you hear me?
Yes, please ask your question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Fantastic, thanks so much. And I apologize for not being there in person because I was very much looking forward to this talk. I had a question about the focus on democracy in this. And it's a question because, so much of the literature on tax and tax avoidance kind of links it to funding welfare states and funding and creating healthy democracies. However, what I find very interesting within the space is that the country with the second largest number of billionaires in the world is China, which is, of course, famously not a democracy. It's also, though, however, a country that has been doing quite a lot in the past 10 years to try to more effectively tax its populace, including things like trying to roll out a worldwide taxation system. Along with other, even trying a US-style taxation system and all of that, which I'm not sure will get off the ground or not, but it's been doing quite a lot. And so I was wondering, I suppose in the first instance, why ignore this number 2 case globally in terms of billionaires? And if it might be possible to specify more clearly what it is about taxation, democracy, and welfare states that would be different for, say, civic participation, welfare state support, which can also occur in autocracies or authoritarian regimes as well.
Thanks, Kristen.
Yeah, thank you, Kristen. The first answer to your question is simply a pragmatic methodological one, where you can find this information both about billionaire speech and about tax minimization much more easily in democracies. And in fact, we had a broad definition of democracies where India, Indonesia, Nigeria were included. But I found that in these kind of more gray cases, the quality of the information we found was also a lot more limited. But there's also a more fundamental answer. I do believe that the deals, as it were, between the super rich and the government, the negotiations, whatever, are fundamentally of a different nature under an authoritarian regime. I know Russia much better than I know China, and I don't think tax payment and tax avoidance are quite the right concepts to capture what is going on there at those very, very top levels. So I think when you're talking about mere millionaires, the situation might be much more similar to that in democracies. But really for these very top billionaires, I do believe that there are kind of more backroom allowances and limitations for the super rich than there are in democracies. That, yeah,
Really
the structure is different.
that relationship between authoritarian billionaires. Max, and then
Thank you. Hello.
Mike. I'll take those. Yeah.
My name's Max. I'm an AFSI fellow at the III. Thank you for this. My question is around, is there any correlation that you've noticed between particularly like pro-tax billionaire speech? It seems like that could be kind of a strategic move to like set the agenda of what's kind of within the realm of possibility and what is outside of the realm of possibility. So is there any correlation between particularly pro-tax speech and then tax policy, or even conversations within kind of the press around, does that set the agenda for kind of where taxation of wealth conversations happen? Is there any way to kind of understand that?
Let me take a couple of questions
Yep,
as well.
yep.
Yes, please.
Okay, I'll Tony Sharks. I'm a visiting professor at the International Institute for Inequalities, but I'm a long-term researcher in wealth inequality. Whenever I listen to these sort of talks, the big thing that seems to be missing is a lack of understanding of what's actually driving these increases in wealth. And this is not, the view that you would get from your talk is that somehow out there, they're all manipulating, they're all using these underhand tactics to increase their wealth. At least in the last 15 years, since the financial crisis, the overriding reason is asset prices have exploded. House prices have done pretty well, but share prices have gone up incredibly, and I think more or less in all countries in the world, in the US in particular, and in particular in the US in a small range of high-tech companies that you all know about. So these people are, this massive increase in wealth holders is largely not because they are amassing more physical wealth. It is simply because they're sitting there on assets. They've got shares in a company and that company is worth more. And but to understand that, or at least to your starting point, I think is quite important. The second thing is, I think that's the reason why since the financial crisis, I really think that there's been a change there. There's been a lot more increase in obvious wealth. We've seen now just almost obscene Elon Musk in the way that he's just flaunting his wealth and doing things which irritate everybody other than him. Is sort of driving this thing, but you've got to unpin some of the underlying reasons and not blame everybody or think everybody's in the same situation. I think. Secondly, you think, what is, firms are going up in price. What do we do about that? Do we want to tax that immediately? Just think, and I think now about what if this is Steve Jobs early on in Apple when he's making a lot of money, he becomes a millionaire. Do we want to tax this guy, or do we want to say, go on doing what you're doing because you're making everyone so happy? I imagine, there would be a lot of support for that sort of thing. And there's a lot of, at least people in the high wealth category who are still in the early stages. And I think this again is giving you a sort of idea that when you're talking about younger people, then maybe they have a different view. I think I'm running out of time, but I've got a lot more to say. But I'm just saying, to not understand, asset prices have gone up. Actually, the reason why that is interest rates have gone down. They've gone down because inflation's much lower, and the inflation's much lower because they privatized, they gave all the central banks independence. So that's the ultimate cause of the growing inequality in the last 15 years.
Marlies, for the final word, I think we'll have 1 minute.
Michael Warren, I'm a research fellow at IA. Okay, so the very short version is interpreting the relative salience of the different tax avoidance strategies. It might be useful to hear more reflections on how they might be doing different jobs in the kind of media debates. I'm thinking specifically about, for example, comparing relocation, which is something that often super rich individuals prefer to talk about than actually do. So in the Speech Act sense, it's really functioning as a threat rather than regular behaviour versus the more technical strategies which people might prefer to do rather than talk about.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah.
Marlies.
Yeah. Okay. Max, is there something strategic for the pro-tax people? My answer is very kind of short and simple, only with the Germans. So the Americans, they just like to talk, and Buffett and Soros are hypocrites, but I don't see strategy. With the Germans, it's very often, yeah, we can have more top income tax, but let's not have wealth tax. So you see more of that. I haven't actually said a word about what drives the increase in wealth, so I don't think I could get it wrong either. My point is that regardless what drives it, the revenue should get its fair share of it. In terms of the argument, the entrepreneur early on, this is in my tax speech a lot from people who are not early on and, not still driving innovation. And I think it's easy to solve technically. You say you're 5-10 years tax-free. You say there's like a floor of 20 million, 50 million, whatever. It's no reason not to tackle taxing the super rich at all. What drives the media stuff? Yeah, so I think tax havens are kind of, disreputable palm trees. Relocation is partly a threat, but partly also disreputable. Whereas, yeah, holding companies are boring. So yeah, that's definitely part of what's going on. And that's why I think in research, we need to go beyond this media strategy, although it has also, got some interesting findings.
Thank you, Marlies. It's been a pleasure. I think we can continue this, but unfortunately, we're out of time. So it's been a great pleasure for me to chair today's event. Thank you, Professor Marlies Glasius, for presenting this seminar, and thanks to everyone in the room, both online and physically. And until next time, thank you and goodbye.